In this section of the lecture, I'm going to talk about World War II and some of the developments that came out of World War II that have relevance to the history of economic development in the latter part of the 20th century. So I'm going to begin by talking about World War II. So, as with our discussion earlier in this lecture of World War I, you can think about sort of three aspects of nexus between war and economic activity. You can think about economic causes of the war. You can think about the extent to which economic factors explain the outcome of the war, and we can think about the economic consequences of the war. If we think first of all about economic causes of the war, so again, recognising that there are many sort of non-economic and other types of factors that cause the war, a lot of accounts nevertheless would regard the economic ambitions of Japan and Germany and their need for more foodstuffs and supplies of raw material as a source of their attempts to expand their territories, and also the failure to re-establish effective economic integration between countries following World War I and the Great Depression as also sort of being a factor that may have contributed to the beginnings of World War II. Turning to the second issue of the role of economy in explaining the outcome of the war, I've included on this slide some similar information to what I included for World War I. So for each of the two sides in the war, the Allies and the Axis powers, at the start of the war, we've got information on their population. So you can see on the Allied side about 700 million, on the Axis side about 250 million, territory size, and also GDP. You can see that GDP, the Allies have slight advantage, but more similar sort of than the amounts at the start of World War I. If we think about the extent to which sort of the resources that are used by each side in the war explain the outcome of the war, then as I talked about with regard to World War I, what matters is not just sort of the size of population or the size of GDP, but also sort of the share of resources that are directed towards military activity. And so if we look at the early stages of World War II, when we see that Germany and Japan are dominant, that's explained to some extent by the fact that in the early stage of the war, even though they might have had less total resources available, they were directing sort of a larger proportion of their resources towards military activity. Obviously other aspects such as strategy were important, but in terms of the amount of resources deployed, in that early period of the war, you need to think not just about the total amount of resources, but the fact that there were differences in the amount of resources deployed. Of course, as the war continues, the Soviet Union and the USA come into the war on the side of the Allies, vastly expanding the population and GDP of the Allies, and also the Allies, the amount that they have, the proportion of their resources they're investing in military activity increases. And so that can be thought of as explaining sort of in some ways the eventual victory of the Allied powers, them turning the war and then ultimately being victorious. On the third issue of the consequences of the war, so I've got a couple of sort of perspectives on that. World War II was hugely destructive, and again, as World War I, especially for countries that were directly involved in the theatre of war. So if you look at Austria, for example, in 1945, after World War II, the last time that Austria's GDP was as low as it was in 1945 was 1886. In other words, what World War II had done was undone the effect of over 50 years of economic growth in Austria. Or in Germany, an economy which had been in some periods sort of industrialised, growing quite strongly, you go back to 1908. So basically undoing sort of 30 years of growth. Similarly in Italy and in France also, it's undoing sort of almost 50 years of growth. So in the countries that were directly involved in the theatre of war, GDP after the war had been pushed back. The clock had been turned back by sort of 40, 50 50 years. That's the extent of the destruction. Other countries, not quite so much, but still sort of substantial. The Netherlands sort of turning back the clock 25 years, Denmark, Finland, Belgium, several years compared to the start of the war. So World War I had a huge cost in terms of GDP. This is sort of using the same method from work by Glick and Taylor as for World War I, looking at the population loss, including dead and injured, and then working out a GDP cost of that, and then looking at the trade consequences and working out a GDP cost of that. So, of course, as before, the costs of population fall on the belligerents who are involved in the war. The trade costs sort of on both of them, the belligerents and the neutrals. If we just focus on the total GDP cost, in brackets I've put the World War I numbers. So you see the cost in terms of international trade is sort of relatively similar between World War I and World War II. But the GDP costs in terms of lives lost were much more substantial, more than double in World War II than World War I. So the human cost of World War II was much more was even more substantial in World War I. And if we add these two numbers together, basically you're talking about the war having lost 4 years of economic growth for these countries. Now, one of the big desires that came out of World War II, I'll turn now to talk about a series of consequences of World War II, was a concern for cooperation. So international economic cooperation had broken down in World War I. It had been restored in a rather precarious way prior to the Great Depression, after which it broke down again. And amongst the sort of leading industrial nations, there was a real concern to rebuild that cooperation after World War II. So recognising sort of the costs that had been incurred by not having cooperation, for example, in some regards that being a contributing factor to the start of World War II, but also, more importantly, the losses in terms of economic activity from not having that cooperation, from the trade barriers that there were between countries, from the economic instability sort of from having countries on a gold standard that wasn't working properly. The industrial nations, sort of the US, Western Europe, were galvanised to try and build a more solid base for economic cooperation and therefore peace after World War II. And so here's a quote I've included from Stephen Broadbury and Mark Harrison, their review of World War I, where they say the main lesson that has emerged from our study of the world wars of the 20th century is that peace is better than war. So I guess that maybe sounds a little bit trite, but they kind of have a serious point to make from it, which is that the best that can be said for World War II, obviously being a terrible event in a whole variety of ways, is that a positive spin-off was a common understanding of this lesson. Whereas, and because of that, the main participants in World War II did seek to cooperate after the war to promote recovery and trade. Whereas after World War I, that had not been a general lesson. Only some of the countries had understood that lesson after World War I, and there hadn't been that. There'd been more concern to settle scores from World War I in some parts than there had been to build a new basis for cooperation. So Broadbury and Harrison are saying, look, World War II, out of World War II, at least you can say that countries understood that they had to, coming out of World War II, establish a base for cooperation in a way that hadn't happened after World War I. And a big part of that was the Bretton Woods Conference. So here's the remarkable Bretton Woods Hotel in New Hampshire. And in 1944, July, delegates from over 40 countries converged on this hotel to negotiate what has thereafter been known as the Bretton Woods Agreement. And the Bretton Woods Agreement established two main areas in which there would be cooperation after the war. So the first was that an agreement that countries would join and fund an organisation known as the International Monetary Fund. Countries who are part of the International Monetary Fund would have their currencies linked to gold, but unlike the gold standard as it had previously operated, countries would have the capacity to vary their exchange rate. And moreover, they would be able to, if they had periods of balance of payments instability, apply to the International Monetary Fund for short-term loans to assist them through the period of sort of balance of payments instability. So the International Monetary Fund and this mechanism were trying to address problems which had existed with the gold standard as it existed, for example, in the Great Depression. First of all, that it wasn't being used as a cooperative mechanism where countries helped each other if they were in trouble. So the IMF was an institution created to help countries if they were in trouble, to be a basis for countries assisting other countries that were in trouble. And also it got over the problem of countries not being able to run an independent macroeconomic policy because of needing to fix their exchange rate or not being able to devalue their currency or appreciate their currency if that was necessary in the interest of managing their macro economic activity. The second part of the Bretton Woods Agreement was the creation of an International Bank for Reconstruction and Development. So this came out of the idea that capital flows hadn't really been sufficient to fund investment that was needed, and that after the war a lot of capital was going to be needed to fund reconstruction in countries that were affected by the war and developing countries to develop. Now, in the event, reconstruction happened more quickly than what was anticipated. And so this organisation, which subsequently renamed the World Bank, has mainly had as its role making loans to developing countries for investment activities that are intended to promote development. A third part of the Bretton Woods, of what was intended to be part of Bretton Woods Agreement, was to set up an international trade organisation. Now that was never sort of ratified, in particular in the United States, but there were sort of other mechanisms by which there was greater cooperation in trade in goods and services. So in 1947, 23 delegates of 23 countries met in Geneva to negotiate this general agreement on tariffs and trade, out of which came agreements to reduce by about a third the rates of tariffs on 45,000 tariff rates, which represented about 50% of global trade at that time. Subsequently, the World Trade Organization was created. Subsequently, there are other rounds of reducing tariffs and restrictions on trade in goods and services, so that by the mid-1960s, after the Kennedy round, tariff rates on non-agricultural products for developed or industrialised economies were below 10%, which is the lowest they'd been since the middle of the middle of the 19th century. Now, as I mentioned, coming out of World War II, there were obviously in Europe sort of countries that had been devastated and needed a huge amount of reconstruction activity. And that was seen as problematic because reconstruction was going to need was going to involve, for example, needing to buy new capital goods, needing to buy the materials that could be used to reconstruct infrastructure like factories and roads and airports and so on. And because Europe had to spend so much of its resources on financing the war and had got so much into debt through financing the war, the problem was, did they have the available resources to finance this reconstruction activity that they needed to do? And so an important part of the initial stage of rebuilding after World War II was something called the Marshall Economic Recovery Plan, by which the United States from 1948 to 1952 provided about $13.5 billion of funding to Western Europe. Now a large motivation for this was the Cold War, which had emerged sort of pretty much immediately in the aftermath of World War II, and a concern by the United States that they wanted to have a strong bulwark in Europe against the emerging Soviet bloc. And they wanted to prevent some countries in the Western Bloc from turning towards socialism and communism, which had become electorally popular in some countries after World War II. So the Marshall Plan sort of financed European imports. It encouraged Western European cooperation, European Monetary Union, the European Coal and Steel Association, European Free Trade Agreement being some examples, as well as strengthening centralist political parties. So as I mentioned, the idea was to try and assist in countries where there was a danger of turning away from centralist political parties towards communist or socialist political parties, and also by often tying the aid to countries removing price controls, removing controls on trade, the Marshall Plan was able to sort of increase the role of markets, promote trade, promote incentives for production in these countries. So there's been some debate about sort of, did the Marshall Plan have an effect? How did it have an effect? It does seem like sort of there's correlation between sort of where aid was given and the rate at which countries came out of or were able to rebuild after World War II. It doesn't seem that was so much because of the direct effect of giving the money. It was about 2.5% of GNP for the countries that were on average for receiving the aid. So it was a reasonable amount, but probably not having huge direct effects on economic activity. But it does seem that it was important in, for example, promoting the cooperation and trade between countries. It was important in pushing countries towards giving markets a greater role in economic activity, and probably to some degree it eased, by easing sort of financial constraints in countries, it allowed for a social contract between business and workers to be more easily established, to give business sort of surety about the returns it would get from making investments in new capital equipment. So I think the general consensus on the Marshall Plan is that what it did is it accelerated rebuilding, sort of, rather than having some long-term permanent effect on the level of economic activity in Europe. That it eased some of the constraints that otherwise would have existed on Europe in rebuilding, and allowed the European economy to rebound very quickly in a way that we'll talk about in the next lecture. The other aspect of coming out of World War II that I want to talk about is decolonisation. So this is a really nice quote from Jeffrey Frieden, which I think kind of effectively summarises in a short space the huge amount of decolonisation that took place in the period very soon after World War II. So Frieden says, a few years after the end of World War II, almost all of colonial Asia was independent. The Japanese had left Korea and Taiwan. The French had left Indochina, and the Dutch the East Indies. As well, French and British mandates in the Near East, Syria, Lebanon, Israel, Jordan were all free. And most important, the jewel in the crown of the United Kingdom, a British India that had stretched from Iran to Laos, was now, after a paroxysm of bloody internecine warfare, 4 free nations: India, Pakistan, Burma and Sri Lanka. Most of North Africa gained its freedom in the period over the course of 1950s, and sub-Saharan Africa starting from 1957, with the exception of Portuguese colonies, and also the remaining Asian possession of the British, Malaysia, in the late 1950s. So a big change in the political landscape in the period 5 to 15 years after World War II. To give one perspective on this, European colonial possessions, which had been 37 million square kilometres in 1938, by 2005 were down to 135,000 square kilometres. So basically sort of down to about 1/200th of what they'd been 60, 70 years before. Why did this episode happen? Well, a variety of explanations. Edamad makes the point that in the end it was probably always going to be the case that the colonial powers would leave these countries. That at the beginning of World War I, they accounted for only 0.5% of the total population in these countries. So the European population in these countries that were colonised was only 0.5%. So there wasn't the thoroughgoing Europeanisation, say, of these countries that occurred, for example, in America, Australia, Canada, New Zealand. And so perhaps numerical insufficiency always meant that there was going to be Europeans exiting at some point. In terms of the exact time at which it happened, so some of the colonies, for example, Korea, Taiwan, are released by what happened in the war. A lot of these colonies had independence movements which had developed in the first part of the 20th century with, for example, growth of middle class in those countries. The colonies probably became decreasingly relevant to the colonisers. So the colonisers in Europe sort of relied more after World War II on trade with each other than on trade with the colonies, for example. And increasingly sort of then the colonies came to be seen and described in terms of being an economic burden to the colonisers. The role of the US was also very important. So the US had tended to be sort of, and Roosevelt was, anti-colonial in its attitudes, and in particular engaged in the Cold War with the Soviet Union, where the Soviet Union was pushing the line to developing countries that we're not a colonial power, whereas the Western world is. The US was very keen not to be able to have that criticism made of it, and so it was very keen for its allies to decolonise, so that in terms of winning support from developing countries, it would not be disadvantaged in that way. Often, though, there was continuing interference by the colonisers in internal politics, and we'll come back to that a little bit when we talk about some of the development experience of countries which had previously been colonised. The relevance of decolonisation, of course, is that we're going to subsequently be talking about the history of economic development in Asia and Africa, and this experience of moving from colonial economic management to now independence and independent economic management is a really important part of this history of economic development of these countries.